Welcome to Globewatch with me, Charles EBUNE. Well, you know, dictatorship naturally arises from out of democracy, and the most aggravated form of tyranny and slavery out of the most extreme liberty. Well, those are the words of one of the most celebrated Greek philosophers, Plato, reflecting so many years ago, and the first British Prime Minister to serve Queen Elizabeth II, Winston Churchill, is remembered to have uttered that the best argument against democracy is a 5-minute conversation with the average voter. Over the years, democracy has been presented as the best platform of governance. By the way, it is the only form of government recognized and adopted by the United Nations Charter. In Africa, it is a dilemma, especially with the African opposition that in most cases rejects the results of an election whenever they are not in favor of them. Is the African opposition an error of democracy? Professor Adebayo Olukoshi, welcome to Globewatch.
Thank you very much, Charles. A pleasure to be here.
Let me just give you a quotation from one of the leading statements from your institution. And that quotation says that we believe that democracy is a universal human aspiration and an experience that is pursued and lived in different ways around the world. It comes in multiple forms. These forms are in constant evolution. There is no single and universally applicable model of democracy. Why do we in Africa always seek that which comes from Europe, therefore?
Well, I suppose this is somewhat connected to our recent history. If you take the full import of that statement, which was integrated into our overall mission presentation as an institution, the message which we wanted to get across was a very simple one. Democracy is part and parcel of the experience and consciousness of all peoples around the world. And so democracy did not begin in Africa only when the continent encountered Europe or in the aftermath of independence from European colonial rule. Democracy has deep and long historical antecedents on our continent as elsewhere in the world. And the second element of that message is that it's important to keep in mind that democracy is not a static experience. It is in constant evolution. So that what, for example, applied in the 19th century in the process of democracy promotion and building around the world may not necessarily be what is in existence in the 21st century. In fact, if you go back only about 150 years ago, the idea that women would vote was actually absent in many democracies that are today defined as some of the most advanced and modern of democracies. Struggles had to be waged by women in England, marching through the streets of England, marching through the streets of the United States, demanding the right to vote and the right to be voted for. And so it is this constant evolution in democratic theory and practice, in the politics of representation and participation, that we also wanted to convey, to say that there is no one-size-fits-all. And what we in Africa need to do, in my view, in order to build systems that are sustainable, is to get out of the mentality of simply copying and mimicking what exists elsewhere. Take time to understand the nature of our societies, the drivers of change in the society, what makes the system function, and build a structure of representation and participation, as well as a system of accountability into it that will ensure that the sovereignty of the citizenry is fully recognized.
One of the key aspects of democracy, probably known by every community in the world, is electoral democracy when it comes to elections. And ever since I became a student of history, I realized that in Africa, when the opposition does not win an election, that election is not free, fair, and transparent. Is that a correct assessment of the situation? You saw all those who observed the elections in Kenya said Raila Odinga lost the elections, but he doesn't want to accept.
Well, I think let's take one step back. First of all, it is true that the vote, the suffrage, and the exercise of the universal suffrage is an integral element of all democracies around the world. But electoral systems also differ from country to country, from region to region. Some countries are proportional representation, some countries are first past the post, some have a mixed system between proportionality and first past the post. And some even use an electoral college as the determinant.
The case of the United States.
The United States, where it is possible for a sitting president like Donald Trump to lose the popular vote and win the electoral college to become president of the United States. So yes, the universal suffrage is an integral part of democracies around the world. The practicalization of that universal suffrage through electoral system design actually varies and is often connected to the history and context of different countries. Now, I think in terms of the modern political history of our continent, we come from a background in which the power of incumbency is a very strong component of our governance system. It's true that around the world, incumbents usually will have some advantage, right? You cannot stop the President of the United States from using the presidential jet or presidential security when going on campaigns, unlike the opposition, will
just
not
like
have the
in Nigeria,
same,
just
as
like in
Nigeria,
Kenya, just like in Cameroon,
all around the world. So incumbency does carry advantage. In our context, however, in the context of Africa, that advantage can sometimes be quite decisive. It can be quite decisive. The power of the incumbent to alter the electoral and political terrain by, for example, changing the system of incentives ahead of an election in order to gain advantage. And you will call it politics. I'm not saying that politicians are saints. There are no saints in politics anywhere in the world. And every politician will look for an advantage or the other. However, I think we are also beginning to see a trend on the continent in which the automatic assumption by those who lose elections to claim that they were cheated out is beginning to change, gradually but surely. And a key element in that change process is the investment which has been made in ensuring that the integrity of elections is assured on an increasing scale. So that if people lose, the assumption automatically that somebody has stuffed the ballot box in favor of the incumbent, and therefore it was not a fair context, is beginning to diminish in some of our countries. Which is why it is not surprising, for example, in contrast, say, to Kenya, that Ghana, which also had elections this year, when the results came, also using technology to collate the results, just as in Kenya, President Mahama, who was the incumbent, saw the trend and took the telephone and called the person who is now the incumbent president to congratulate him as leader of opposition, to say, I concede. You saw it also in Nigeria, neighboring Nigeria, where Jonathan Goodluck, in the face of intense tension, actually, and some of his supporters senior political supporters telling him not to accept, actually picked up the phone and phoned and called President Buhari to concede. It may not have been perfect, but it was broadly representative of the will of Nigerians. And there are no perfect elections anywhere in the world, believe you me, regardless of the state of advancement.
You just said that the environment is gradually improving, of accepting defeat and moving forward in a kind of way that reduces tensions insofar as the transition of power is concerned in most African countries. Nigeria, Rwanda, Ghana, Botswana, South Africa can serve as tangible models. Yeah. What are the inputs? What are the factors that account for this improving environment?
I think first and foremost, one must give credit to the electoral management bodies on the continent. Quite a good number of them have invested heavily with support from within and outside their countries in, quote unquote, their independence. I much rather would say autonomy. In other words, election management bodies presided over by a group of people who are generally seen to be people of integrity and who are not taking instructions from anybody, either from the ruling or from the opposition.
Like it was the case with Professor Jega in Nigeria.
Exactly.
He used to be guest on this program.
And that is exactly what made it difficult to reproach the outcome of the presidential elections in Nigeria. Because Professor Jega was the returning officer for the presidential elections. And regardless of what you might say about the shenanigans of politics in Nigeria, most Nigerians knew Jega to be a man of honor and integrity who would not be party to any unfair game on either side. And for him to have pronounced and stood his ground the way he did, to produce actually an outcome in which for the first time, mind you, in the political history of Nigeria, an incumbent lost to an opposition candidate. Nigerians were prepared to say that this was reflective of their will. So I think the integrity of the election management body and of its managers is an important component of what we see that is changing. A second component I would suggest is related to what you might call technology, broadly speaking. But technology here, including also social media, which makes it possible for you and I, in a good number of countries, to know the results of the elections in real time. You don't have to wait anymore for 1 week for somebody to come and announce. They might do that protocol officially, but in a place like Cape Verde, the Election Commission of Cape Verde has an application which any citizen of Cape Verde can download. Even I, as a non-citizen, can go to their website and download the free application. And an election takes place in Cape Verde. Polls close at 6 p.m. By midnight, if I put on the application, I can see the results in real time on my telephone. And that's the kind of change which we see technology bringing.
Is that the kind of model and technological inputs we should be injecting into our electoral systems? You know that much of the bloodshed we have seen on the continent has basically been on who gets the office syndrome.
No, true. I mean, elections remain very contentious on our continent. And too much violence is still associated with electoral processes on the continent. And this has to change without any question. But if you go to some of the countries we cover as International IDEA, we actually note that it is in some instances the opposition that is calling for the use of technology in order to guarantee the integrity of the process. In some instances. In others, it is the election management bodies themselves that are convinced in one form or the other that their tasks will be made easier if they were able to deploy biometric technology, for example, for registering voters. Because in that way, nobody can vote twice, at least in a technical sense. One fingerprint is unique to one individual, and that's it. Some others feel that they need technology for the transmission of the results. Not so much even for the stage of the voting, as much as once it is collated, how do you transmit it across in a country which is vast. So there are different sources of pressure for technology to be applied. In my view, some progress is being made. Much more work still needs to be done. The cost of technology is not easy for too many countries to bear. It can be quite an expensive investment to make. And just like your mobile phone, you buy a Samsung 2016 or 2017 edition. By January next year, it is out of date. A 2018 edition comes
absolutely. In. Over the years, the International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance remains one of the indelible inks. When they say elections are credible, they are credible. And this is what you say. Our mission is to support sustainable democratic change through providing comparative knowledge and assisting in democratic reform and influencing policies and politics. What concretely have you done on the African continent to improve the elections climate?
At the continental level, we have a very strong partnership with the African Union Commission, working mainly through the Department of Political Affairs of the Union to support the election division of the Department of Political Affairs. And that division is responsible for the recruitment, training, and dispatching of all the AU observer missions that go out. So we work very strongly with them at that level. And in that context, we also attempt to try to develop what we call a continental norm and standard framework, such that we are able to measure performance of election management bodies from one country to the other on the basis of an agreed continental norm and standard of how an election can be conducted with integrity.
You participate, and you have participated in the monitoring, observation, and writing, and probably the proofreading of post-election reports in most African countries. What is the major challenge you have sorted out, which stands as this is what is responsible for the recurrent chaos and misunderstandings we see from time to time?
It's multifaceted, and it might actually sometimes vary from country to country. In some instances, depending on the time frame you are looking at, we are dealing with poorly equipped election management bodies. Now, if you have a referee of a complex game like an election who doesn't have the people or the equipment or the resources to run any credible election, you have a recipe for chaos. Because effectively, elections will then be stolen by those who have the resources to do so. And results that are declared will be reflective of the dysfunction in the system. In other instances, to be quite fair, election commissions do their best, but politicians themselves are the problem. Between ruling and opposition, not having any trust in the system and prepared to use every trick in the book in order to wrong-foot commissions, in order to wrong-foot their opponents and competitors, and in order to, if in some instances, outrightly cheat the system to get outcomes. And you probably will not be surprised by that, because in a lot of cases, many of our countries, at least at the beginning of their transition to electoral pluralism, did not actually have rules to govern the behavior of candidates. Hate speech of somebody going on a radio and spreading totally false rumors about an opponent, of using ethnicity and religion as a weapon in election campaigns at a time when we are trying to build nations and to promote national unity. And this is done on both sides, ruling party and opposition, of people using criminal money, including drug lords sponsoring candidates. You've heard the notion of godfathers in politics.
I have tried to read the database of most African electoral systems. When you look at opposition parties in particular, when they have rallies, you have thousands and thousands, if not of young people attending their rallies. But the sad reality is that those young people are not registered. So when the election result is proclaimed, the only language they tell him is that your victory has been stolen, go to the streets. What message do you have to the young people in particular who constitute a majority of the population and of the voting age, but the day the game is being played, they are not players on the field?
It's the same message that Jesse Jackson used to give to the black young African Americans in the United States when he was still very much active. And you remember he used to say to them ahead of elections, there is a freedom train that is coming, right? And your freedom will come. All your complaints about the dysfunction in the American system will be redressed. But in order for that to happen, you have to register. Don't just walk away from the system, register. And I think that's the message which especially opposition leaders have to get across to their supporters. As you rightly said, the rally could be a small indicator of popularity of a candidate, but it can also simply be a social event, an entertainment activity, which every passerby is invited to stop and observe. It doesn't mean that those who are at the rally 100% support you, not all of them. It doesn't mean that even those that support you are all registered to make the difference. And a process of political education, which has to be undertaken by political parties themselves, that will incorporate an element of persuading, encouraging their supporters to be registered, is a key part. Mr. Barack Obama won a second term in the United States, partly because through big data techniques, he was able to pinpoint his support base and to send targeted messages to individuals, not even to groups alone, individuals, that you, Charles, will get a message from the Barack Obama campaign to check with you whether you have registered and to remind you as a democratic voter in the United States in that locality that the registration deadline is in 48 hours. And on election day to check with you, have you gone to vote? You see what I mean?
Let me go back to a quotation which I introduced at the beginning of the interview, talking about the statement of Winston Churchill, the former British Prime Minister, qualifying democracy, and this is what he said. The best argument against democracy is a 5-minute conversation with the average voter. So many African countries will be having elections next year or in the days ahead. What does that statement mean to them?
Well, it was one of the cynical moments of Sir Winston Churchill. I guess perhaps one of the best answers to him will be to quote another activist political actor who particularly used poetry as his instrument of communication in Germany. And he said, you know, when governments and politicians blame the people and the voter and, you know, things are not going right, and he said, isn't it better in that case if the governments were to dissolve the people and elect a new one that will conform to their wishes? I think the truth of the matter is that across the world, we see a recession in voter participation in democratic politics. It's particularly bad in the United States and Europe. That if you actually looked at the number of those who actually vote as a proportion of those who register to vote and who are eligible to register to vote, most American presidents have been elected by a minority of the population. And that is same thing going on across Europe, the so-called mature democracies, facing a period of recession. And we see a few cases in Africa where that is also beginning to emerge. Look at the figures from the 1990s to date, a gradual trend of decline.
Why?
In voter turnout. Mixture of things. Apathy. I mean, politicians in every opinion poll in Europe are the least trusted public figures.
They tell a lot of lies.
Well, they make a lot of promises they cannot fulfill. Let me put it that way.
You are simply being too polite to them. I am like Donald Trump. There is nothing like journalistic correctness. Yeah, Donald Trump will say there is nothing like political correctness. Absolutely. I am not practicing any journalistic correctness.
People see, a kind of musical chairs.
Okay.
And in the meantime, their conditions are not improving in a radical way.
Okay. The Director of Asian and African Affairs at the International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance, Professor Adebayo Olukushi, thank you very much indeed for being guest on Globewatch.
Thank you very much indeed. It's been a pleasure to be here, Charles.
You are welcome.
All the very best.
Thank you.